So I'm Arlene Lang. I'm the coordinating director for the Caribbean Meteorological Organization, headquartered here in Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm very pleased to have you join us for this momentous occasion, the year of Jubilee. But actually, we go way back. I would like to say that we have come from 1951 to 50 years, because today we're going to be highlighting three of our pioneering meteorologists who started in Dr. Lee started 1949, even before the official formation of what became the British Caribbean Meteorological Service. So what we're going to be doing in terms of our agenda today is I will do an introduction about the history of the CMO, and then we will transition into a question and answer with each of the distinguished meteorologists who have joined us. I will be speaking with each of them and asking a number of questions of them, beginning with Dr. Lee, then with Dr. Garstang, and then with Dr. Leslie. This is in the chronological order in which they joined the meteorological service in the region. And as persons join us, we will acknowledge those who are leaders and dignitaries and so on. I'm depending on my staff to let me be aware of those who are joining us during the proceedings. So I welcome you all, and I will be sharing my screen. First of all, I want to say thank you to our three distinguished panelists for agreeing to join us and taking the time from their schedule to prepare for this special anniversary. So, as I mentioned before, I'm Arlene Lang. I'm here in the Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. And this year marks not only our 50th, but as one of the oldest regional institutions of CARICOM, they're also celebrating their 50th year this year. So Trinidad and Tobago has been quite busy in terms of recognizing 50th anniversaries. The Caribbean Meteorological Organization membership stands at 16 English-speaking member states, from Belize in the west to Guyana in the south. We started out 1941, it turned out, as part of the UK Air Ministry Meteorological Services. And Dr. Lee is the one person from that era who is still with us. And he was one of those first persons who were hired with the UK Air Ministry Meteorological Services. The British Caribbean Meteorological Service was established formally in 1951. And in 1953, the British Overseas Territories in the Caribbean joined the World Meteorological Organization as the British Caribbean Territories. So this is also a special year for the BCT, as this is the 70th year of the BCT as a member of WMO, and this was recognized at the Executive Council meeting that was held in February of this year. With the transition to the West Indies Federation, the Met Service then became the West Indies Meteorological Service. Then in 1962, at the breakup of the Federation, it was recognized that there was still the need for regional oversight of meteorology. And in the screen is showing the regional conference that was held in November 1962 by the heads of government to determine what to do with the meteorological services. And this was when they formed the Meteorological Council, with the responsibility of the general control of the meteorological service to be comprised of one representative from each of the participating territories. And those territories at that time are listed as shown here from the summary of discussions. The Caribbean Meteorological Service then was then transitioned with the new name, 1963, and the headquarters remained in Trinidad and Tobago, where I am to this day as the headquarters of what is now the CMO. Then the CMS provided a proposal, and Dr. Lee will tell us some more about that later, to establish a Caribbean Meteorological Institute with support from the United Nations Development Program and the World Meteorological Organization. So here we have the summary minutes from that meeting in Jamaica, noting that the conference had proposals they were aware that there were proposals for the establishment of a Caribbean Meteorological Institute, and that would be submitted at a later date. So now we're looking now at this broad history. Then in 1972, the Commonwealth Heads of Government, having recognized, of course, that we were in the period of independence movements and national meteorological services were being formed, but there was still a need for coordination across the region and between the Institute and the Council. They decided to form the CMO with the headquarters remaining in Trinidad and Tobago. In August 73, of course, there's the formation of the CARICOM. And then the umbrella organization that became the CMO from all of these former entities formed was in October 1973. The 19th of October was when the agreement was signed in Basse-Terre, St. Kitts, to form what is now known as the CMO. It was established as a specialized institute for the promotion and coordination of regional activities in the field of meteorology and allied sciences. Over the years, other things have changed. In 1982, the CMO formed a Caribbean Operational Hydrology Institute. And through the 80s, there was an amalgamation of the meteorological and hydrological components. And the institute was then renamed as the Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. But that formal designation actually did not happen until 1999. And so here we are now with the complement of the formal CMO organs. So that brings us to our webinar today. We're going to go back to the 1950s, to the pioneers of that era on who built the foundation on which we're all standing now. And they're stalwarts of meteorology because they laid the foundation here and then they went on to contribute across the globe and to our region. So I will begin with Dr. John Lee. He has, of course, a long history, and these photographs, as you see, are from those early days. He started in 1949, and you can see he still has that same hairstyle that he did back then. This was the first forecaster training course. I believe this was 1953, but Dr. Lee will tell us. And in this photo are John Blake, who I knew as the director in Jamaica of their Met Service, Mr. Nanku, and his grandson is in our audience right now. So you can see meteorology, he left a great legacy. That meteorology continues to be a part of his family to this day. Dr. Lee went on to be a professor, to be the first founding director of the Trinidad and Tobago Met Service. He was also a professor at Penn State University Meteorology Department. He went on also to be, he did all of his degrees at the Florida State University from 1967 through 74, I believe. I hope I got that right. Then from 74 to 75, he had a fellowship to the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder. Then he went on to Penn State from 1974 through 1978. Then in 1978, he moved on to the World Meteorological Organization's Education and Training Division. And also, interestingly, he spent 5 years in Saudi Arabia from January 82 to 86, and then returned to Penn State in 1987, from where he ultimately retired from having served in various roles in the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences. So he also, I knew him primarily before I knew him in person as having developed a course in tropical meteorology, Carlson and Lee, this book that was used by the meteorologists in the region to learn all about tropical meteorology. This was a big contribution. In this picture also, you will see the very first director of the British Caribbean Meteorological Service, Mr. Grinstead. His deputy, Mr. Nichols, went on to become director in the 1960s. So I will stop sharing my screen, and then I will proceed to discuss with Dr. Lee some more about the history of his. So Dr. Lee, I have a number of questions for you. And first of all, I want to find out what made you apply for your first job in the meteorological services? Can you hear me? I'm not hearing you, Dr. Lee. I hope you can hear me. Dr. John Lee, your sound.
He's connecting. He should be getting there now.
Okay, all right. He was early. I can see him, but I'm not seeing his sound.
Say something. Can you hear me?
Can you
Oh,
hear me?
yes, I can hear you now, John. Go ahead, please.
Well, I was seeing everything that went on before, but I heard nothing.
Okay, so I'm asking, can you tell us what made you apply to your first job in the meteorological service?
Well, it was a better paying job than the one I was doing. And I was just trying to make money so I could get out of Trinidad to go to study engineering.
Okay, I mean, having a livelihood is a major incentive for everyone.
Yes.
So once you started, how did your job change from the early years until you left for further studies?
Well, I started as an observer and, really observed.
Oh, John, Dr. Lee, your video went away for some reason. His video screen got blocked. I'm not sure what's going on. Let's see if we can see you again. We can still certainly hear you. Okay. I will ask you to start your video again, if you're able to. Dr. Lee? I hope you can hear us. I guess he's gone in and he will rejoin. I'm not sure what's going on.
I have no idea what happened.
Dr. Lee?
Yes, I'm sorry. Something happened and I got disconnected.
You're still here with us. We can hear you, but we can't see you. Now we can see you again. Yes. So tell us a little bit about how things changed in terms of your job through the years before you left for further studies.
Well, as I was saying, my first job, of course, was an observer. We are the ones who make the basic data, the observations, plot the charts for the forecasters to use. Then, of course, I became a forecaster, so I was using the information to create forecasts. Mainly, we serviced the airline industry, but we also had some contact with the press and the local public and that sort of thing. Then, of course, when I became director, I had to see about hiring staff, training staff, doing budgets, sort of dealing with the whole operation, overseeing things, trying to improve the services, that sort of thing.
Okay. I wanted to find out what were some of the places where you served?
Well, I served in the three main offices: Trinidad, Jamaica, Bahamas.
Okay. What were some of your favorite memories of that period in the 1950s and 60s with the Caribbean Meteorological Service?
I guess the opportunity to travel to the different places, get to know my fellow colleagues, sort of form some lifelong friendships with some of them. Certainly in the Bahamas, where I spent almost 3 years, I had the opportunity to, and the honor, to supervise the training, on-the-job training of 5 newly minted forecasters, 2 of whom became directors in their national services. It was there also that I suggested to Nichols that we should establish an institute. When I came back to Trinidad as director, having to deal with staff and staff welfare, I had to face some commissions that were undergoing regrading and reorganization of services. One of the things I did was to have to represent the observers and the jobs they did. And they had asked me to get them a certain salary scale, and it ended up I got them one level higher than they asked me for. So that is some of the things I can remember.
Okay. What do you consider to be some of the biggest achievements of the Caribbean Meteorological Service at the time?
Oh boy, that's a difficult one to answer. I really can't think. I mean, at that time we were struggling, to get our feet. The federation had collapsed. We were essentially starting from scratch, rebuilding the services. We were all independent. Of course, with the creation of the CMS, we sort of put heads together because it was beneficial for us to develop as a group rather than to go each one our separate ways, which of course we had to do also. So it's difficult really for me to pinpoint anything special.
You mentioned though that you had proposed to Mr. Nichols about the Institute. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it's a strange thing, really. I was being selfish. I was one of 4 people who were probably going to be considered for top positions. I really had no interest in being an administrator. I was more interested in the scientific aspects, the technical aspects. I felt I was not really going to be picked for one of the directorship positions. So I felt an institute would be a place where I could have a home, that I could be happy.
Okay. Thank you for that. Because you were looking for a home, we have an institute that was established in 1967 based on your proposal to Mr. Nichols. So can you mentioned a number of persons whom you supervised who went on to be leaders in Caribbean meteorology. Are there any others that you might want to tell us about with whom you interacted or supervised, or you mentioned the supervised ones, but there are others who are colleagues who are no longer with us. Are any of those that you might want to mention?
Oh yeah, sure. Mike Nanku, who was the second person with me to become forecasters, the first forecasters, local forecasters. He went on to have a long career with the International Civil Aviation Organization in Canada. He actually had 2 postings in Mexico for the organization, the second of which he was the station chief. So, that was quite a step up for him. There was my good friend Edward Berridge, who essentially I think I had a hand in him becoming my successor and then going on to become the coordinating director. We know of his career. And of course, there were 2 good friends, Don Vickers and Jeff Brother, both of whom ended up in WMO.
Thank you. I had the privilege of meeting Mr. Rudder in Barbados on a number of occasions. Quite a gentleman and quite funny.
Yes.
Quite a big sense of humor. We lost him quite recently, and we lost Mr. Vickers as well quite recently.
In fact, as I remember, we had a young man who became an observer, but he didn't stay long with us. He left, he went to England to study, came back home, he got involved in politics, and I believe he became, for a term, the president of the Senate. in Trinidad.
Okay, so meteorology led to all sorts of different and interesting things.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
You had also mentioned a John Whitcomb in our earlier conversation.
Yes. John Wickham was one of the very first observers in the Caribbean. I believe the first observing station was in Barbados, and John was one of the originals in that system. He came to Trinidad. He was the senior assistant. He was the one essentially who hired me into the service.
Mhm.
He, towards the end of the Federation, he received an MBE for his services. At the same time, Grinstead received an OBE. Wickham went on to England, and I believe he was attached to the Trinidad High Commission. He then went to the headquarters, WMO headquarters in Geneva. When the institute was established, he came back down, and I think he was the first librarian because he was a literary person. On his retirement, he became an independent senator in the Barbados government representing the arts. He made contributions to the Bajan magazine in Barbados. He published a little book of poems called Casuarina Row.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe he was a member of the early movement of the Caribbean literary movement. I think he was a colleague of people like, I'm forgetting names now, Walcott and Selvon and those guys.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Lee. I am so appreciative of your contributions and that foundation that you laid for us. And I should indicate to our audience here that when I went to Penn State, Dr. Lee and his wife, Andrea, came and got me. And in our audience are several other persons who would have been at Penn State and were adopted by John and his wife, Andrea, who fed us very well through those years at Penn State. So I will thank you, Dr. Lee. I will move on now to our next pioneer, and I will share my screen so we can introduce another gentleman whom I had the pleasure of meeting a long time ago when I was a graduate student at Penn State. This is Dr. Michael Garstang, and he is a distinguished research professor, or was a distinguished professor at the University of Virginia. He has, of course, a major career having been established, particularly with field work and observations of the tropical atmosphere. When I was a young professor at the University of South Florida, I actually used his textbook, that's the red one in the corner there, in my tropical meteorology courses. One of his big contributions early in the Caribbean was a tritium buoy 110 feet to provide measurements at the sea surface. And the picture that you're seeing there was from the Florida State Barbados experiment, I believe. He will correct me if I'm wrong, which was one of two experiments that were done out of Barbados. And he will provide us with some more. But basically, he did a lot of work with regard to deep convection over the tropics and the development of instrumentation and testing of those instruments over the years. He had 24 students with doctoral degrees under his direction and 16 master's students. One of his students, Dr. Fitzgerald, with whom he wrote that book, was awarded the AMS's Award for Outstanding Achievement in Biometeorology, and others went on to great distinction around the globe: New Zealand, Australia, India, South Africa, Argentina, and Brazil, and of course in the Caribbean. And he remains in touch with all of these scholars and is very proud to do so. From my part, my first encounter with Dr. Garstang was as a young graduate student giving my first presentation to the American Meteorological Society's mesoscale conference. And I was presenting on mesoscale convective systems over India. And I the room is dark except for the front row, which I can just see the faces in the front row. I can't see the rest of the audience. And I give my presentation first, nervous, and I'm finished, and they ask for questions from the audience. And out of the audience in the dark comes a voice like Vincent Price. And that was my very first question from anyone at an AMS conference, was from Dr. Garstang, coming out of the darkness. But he was very kind. And I thank him for later on being so encouraging in our meetings when we did meet in person. But it was rather scary to hear him for the first time coming out of the dark. This picture here are pictures that he shared, and one of them describes that 1968 experiment where they installed a full-scale wind tunnel to test instruments. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll have a discussion with Dr. Garstang, and I will ensure that he is spotlighted here so that we can see each other and you can see him. So Dr. Garstang, we have some similar questions for you, as in, what made you apply to join the British Caribbean Meteorological Service in 1954, I believe? You're muted, so let's unmute first. You need to unmute.
Okay, Arlene, if I could do it at the time, I would have responded to your enthusiasm. Thank you very much for your remarks. I responded to a British Colonial Office solicitation for meteorologists in the Caribbean as the Caribbean Meteorological Service was being formed in the early 1950s. That was 1954. And fortunately, I got the position and was on my way to Trinidad. I grew up in a very small village in South Africa in the Veld. The font of all knowledge in the village of 800 people was a lady called Aunt Maria. And Aunt Maria was asked one Saturday morning, "Where is Mike Garstang?" She said, "Oh, I think he's in Timbuktu." That was the news they came to Trinidad. So my trip to the Caribbean was wonderful. I had to do 6 months training in Britain under the Air Ministry School. Tropical meteorology was at its infancy. There was no textbook in tropical meteorology. There were residual manuals from World War II. The US Navy lost more men and ships to the weather in the Pacific War than they did to the war itself. Moving into the Caribbean was moving into an area that had a minimum of observational material that you could work on. Forecasting was a great challenge, but certainly one that was enjoyable.
So I asked you the same question in terms of during your time in the British Caribbean Meteorological Services, how did your job change when you first arrived to when you finally left?
I think probably a major change was the connection that was established with Barbados and the currents of the hurricane. I think that story has been told many times. I was the forecaster on duty at Piarco at 11 o'clock at night on some night of the hurricane season year. And we had one ship in the middle of the tropical Atlantic that had a strange wind, a wind coming from the north quite strongly. That wind was anomalous. It was not part of the trade system. It suggested a vortex and possibly a hurricane. It was 11 o'clock at night. And it was, if you did the calculations as to when that hurricane, if it was a hurricane, how long it would take to get to Barbados, will be in Barbados by 8 o'clock the next morning. We had no alternative but to call a full-scale warning to Barbados. Fortunately, Dr. Cecil Skeet of Barbados was our main contact. He was the director of agriculture. He had the connections to the Barbados police system. The police with loudspeakers went across the island, warning everyone they could. And at 8 o'clock the next morning, the hurricane hit Barbados. So that was probably the seminal occasion of sort of saying, we need to know more about the atmosphere and what happens. So it was a challenge.
And that was Hurricane
Hurricane
Hazel? Was it Hazel or not Hazel? Which one was it?
Janet.
Janet, Hurricane Janet. I'm
Janet.
sorry, I'm mixing them up. Hurricane Janet.
Yes, I think there was one serious sort of set of casualties. If my memory serves me rightly, there was a shelter taken in a church, and the church collapsed, and
Okay.
there was casualties there, injuries, but by and large, the island was, by 8 o'clock that next morning, the island was prepared for a hurricane.
That is amazing that you had one ship observation and you were able to protect the whole island from that due to your vigilance and your understanding of tropical cyclone structure.
Well, yes, minimal at the time. Unfortunately, yes. It has grown. The interesting fact on that was in that morning, we, of course, gave forecasts to all aircraft leaving Trinidad, and the Canadian Airliners navigator came in with the forecast to go to Barbados on his way to Canada. And I said, I'm sorry, I've notified the tower, Barbados has been notified, Barbados is untenable. You will not be able to land in Barbados. You will have crosswinds. It will be extremely dangerous. He said, I'm sorry, we're flying as EC6 and the captain is leaving. And indeed, the captain ignored the tower and their advice, our advice, and he tried to land in Barbados 3 times, apparently slewing down the runway or above the runway. Had he landed, he would have crashed. The next day, he came into the office. We were working 16 hours off and 8 hours on. So the next day, I was on duty again. And he walked in the office and said, what do you want? He said, I'd like a forecast. I said, no, I'm not giving you a forecast. I gave you one yesterday. And you ignored it. It was absolutely incredible, but that sort of gives you an illustration of the sort of situation that was in the 1950s.
Things have certainly changed. Now we have satellite imagery, we have radar. Barbados has a dual polar radar. We have so many more things that can guide us. Back then you had that one ship that happened to be in a good location and you were paying attention, and that protected Barbados.
Exactly. What we had to rely on, and I'm sure John Lee will confirm this, was the overseas cross-ocean flights. And the navigators on those commercial flights were asked to come in and debrief the forecast that they had received, wherever their departure point had been in Europe or North America, and give us the benefit of the weather on the way down. And that was a huge help because for instance, KLM, the Dutch airline, flew from the Azores directly to Barbados at that time. So that was a wonderful crossing that gave us a central North Atlantic that we really need to know details about. And they were very good about coming in, even though it was a long flight. They would come in and give us a total debriefing of what they had seen. Similarly, flights from South America and North America would do the same thing. So we relied heavily upon the airlines themselves to supply additional information.
That's great. That level of cooperation by those who need your information but are also providing it, that continues to be a hallmark of meteorology, because we recognize that without that international cooperation, we wouldn't really be able to provide the services that are needed by everyone.
Right.
So that is a hallmark of meteorology that everyone else, I think, can learn from, that cooperative model. You've already described what happened with Janet. Do you have anything else that you consider to be major achievements or successes of your time within the working with the British Caribbean Meteorological Service and later on the Institute and the Caribbean Meteorological Service?
We issued forecasts for all the islands. At that time, we were responsible for all the windwards from Puerto Rico to Trinidad and down to Guyana. We issued daily forecasts for them. They were difficult to do, but frequently, particularly during the dry season, we would have outbreaks of Saharan dust, and the navigation was extremely difficult because some of the inter-island flights were really navigating by eyeball. They weren't navigating with instrumentation. They didn't have it. They would know where the cumulus clouds had built up over islands. They would fly to that cumulus buildup, and below that would be the island. Well, when the dust events occurred, they were unable to find their way. More than one Leeward Island aircraft landed up in Venezuela.
Wow.
With passengers. And we of course issued daily forecasts to the Trinidad Guardian. The Trinidad Guardian, on one forecast where I had said it will be a fair morning, but showers will move from east to west across the island in the afternoon. The forecast that the Guardian printed was, it will be a fair morning, but the island will move from east to west in the afternoon.
Trinidad was going to move.
It was a wonderful place to work, and that really, with connections to Barbados, and you mentioned the amount of instrumentation that was developed there together with the Institute, and support from the United States, strong support from the National Science Foundation, from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and from the universities to Barbados. And for the 10 years of the 1960s, we prepared for that huge experiment called the GATE Atmospheric Tropical Experiment, which included the whole Caribbean and all the way to Africa. And that laid the foundation for current day work. And we're celebrating that this year, or actually this year, and will almost certainly be combining work that's been done both in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, and in the Atlantic together, as it's obvious now from all the research done that the oceans, the tropical oceans, which actually occupy 80% of the Earth's surface, so they're a significant part of what controls the weather. And yet they still are not, they were better observed during World War II than they are now.
Yes.
Despite the fact that we have satellites, and other advanced technology, it doesn't have the resolution of feet on the ground and instruments, that you can deploy. But it's now evident that, I'm afraid to say, with artificial intelligence, we're going to have to take every opportunity we can to combine this large oceanic-driven system to establish the heat balance of the planet and to try and deal with this issue of global warming, which is a very real phenomena and one which is a serious one from virtue of the survival of our planet.
Thank you, Dr. Garstan. In the Caribbean, we're very much aware of the impact of the changing climate on our environment and on our societies, and our governments have articulated that they'd like us to become more climate resilient, or resilient to extreme weather and climate. And in fact, our theme of this year is about weather and climate and water, leading us to a more resilient and sustainable development. And so I'm so thankful for your words, and thankful that you have laid a wonderful and strong foundation for us to continue to build on. And I certainly appreciate hearing your stories and your continued involvement in the region, even after having left officially as a forecaster, is much appreciated.
Yes.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now we will shift to our next panelist. I will share my screen here and have our discussion with Dr. Leslie. Dr. Kenrick Leslie has a great tradition here. He started out actually in what was then at that time the West Indies Meteorological Service during the time of the Federation. And he was pivotal in establishing the Meteorological Service of Belize and served as its first director from 72 to 81. And he, as like Dr. Lee, and also served in various islands. And he most recently had the extreme distinction, and we're very grateful for his contribution to this, of being the first executive director of the Caribbean Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, or 5Cs as we affectionately know it. And he was just recently, one of his main achievements, I should say, before he demitted office, was the LIDAR, which our region now has a LIDAR that can go out and map the surface of, which has been really useful in terms of mapping the coastal environment, that helps us to deal with things like storm surge modeling. And he has, of course, been one of those principal persons involved in the UNFCCC, that's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, working on behalf of the region at the annual Conference of the Parties. There's a picture of him here from the negotiations in 2016. And those negotiations are bearing fruit now with the establishment of like the loss and damage funding that's still being negotiated. But to get that even to the point that we are now is basically the foundation that Dr. Leslie laid. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And Dr. Leslie, I welcome you, and I thank you so much for joining us. And I want to ensure that you're spotlighted appropriately. So I'm going to add that spotlight there so everyone can focus on you. I wanted to ensure that our audience here is aware also that, you know, you have been just a stalwart defender of CMO and its activities as well. You also served on the board of governors of the CIMH as part of your contribution. And thank you so much for joining us. I have that same question for you as for your colleagues. what made you apply to join the meteorological service? I'm going to ask you to unmute first because you're still muted. Yes, I think you should be fine now. Can you hear us?
First of all, Dr. Lang, I'd like to thank you for extending the invitation for me to participate in this special anniversary. And to the question, if you believe in divine intervention, I think that is the case that I come under. I knew nothing about meteorology, what was involved with it, or anything of the sort. However, in 1959, January, we had a visitor to Belize, the deputy director of the Federation Med Service, Mr. Nichols, and he gave a radio address, and he was soliciting people with suitable qualifications in mathematics and physics to apply to join the meteorological service to be trained as a forecaster. And believe it or not, I did not hear that address, but a colleague of mine did.
Okay.
And actually filled out an application on my behalf.
Oh.
And to my surprise, I got a letter from Mr. Nichols asking me to write an examination in mathematics, pure and applied, and physics, which I did. That followed with an invitation to join the service for training at the British Meteorological Service Center in London. And that is how I got into meteorology. And to this day, I have never regretted a day that I joined it.
That's wonderful to hear. So what are some of your favorite memories of your time in the service, the regional service?
Well, two things. One, the camaraderie between a young person like myself joining the service and coming back from UK. And as both Dr. Garstang and Dr. Lee mentioned, they had very little knowledge about tropical meteorology. So when I came back, my mentors were Mr. Nanku, who was then one of the senior forecasters at CARICOM. And he gave me the best in terms of understanding when you draw a chart, what you should look for, and in the hurricane season, what you should look for between Africa and Barbados. And later on, and this is something that is missing, in my opinion, in terms of training. You see, at that time, when we came back from England, we spent 4 months in Trinidad at CARICOM to learn the weather systems that would affect the Eastern Caribbean and Northern South America, where we had British Guyana. So you were very involved in terms of understanding the fickleness of the systems in the Eastern Caribbean. And then you spend another 4 months in Jamaica, where you were responsible for Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, and British Honduras. And like Guyana, British Honduras is a mainland country that is not an island. And so you learn to understand the features that you would have to deal with, which were quite different from the Eastern Caribbean. And at the end of that, we spent 4 months in the Bahamas. And this is where I met my good friend, John Lee, along with Don Bakers. And those two gentlemen imparted to this young forecaster all that we needed to understand in terms of systems moving from North America into the Bahamas, which again was quite different. So we had a knowledge of the whole area, and the camaraderie was so great that it is something that will forever stick in my mind. John in particular, and as you mentioned, his wife Andrea, was always there to provide my meals and also to provide me with the technical expertise if you wanted to become a good forecaster. So those are some of the memories that I would have in terms of the camaraderie of dealing with meteorology in the early days of the Caribbean. I don't think you have that today because you are trained and you are posted in your own country. And all you know is to use the models for your country, but you never think about how and when, if you would have to be transferred to another country, how you would apply yourself immediately. So those are some of the things I would want to encourage at this point in time from my own personal experience.
Yeah, that's a great history to learn about, and I think we do have that camaraderie somewhat still because so many of our personnel are trained at the Institute. And so some of that still is retained, but not to the same degree as you had in your time. I think that is one of the strengths of the Caribbean and the CMO. So I wanted to ask you, in terms of, were there any individual success stories or achievements during that time that you might want to call out? Maybe you didn't have a Janet, but maybe there is something else that you might want to remember or us to remember.
Yes, but surprisingly, Janet affected Barbados in the beginning and came all the way across the Caribbean and seriously impacted the northern part of Belize. It destroyed the northern tongue almost 100%.
Wow.
1955. So I remember Janet not from being a forecaster, but more importantly, as it impacted our country.
Okay.
And I would like to add in terms of what Dr. Garstang mentioned about using the ships. You see, today, we have a lot of technology, but again, I'm not saying that technology is not good because we all benefit from satellite pictures, radars, and so on. But in the early days of forecasting, you learn to use things like the period between swells. Because you look at the ship between Africa and the Eastern Caribbean, and all you had was whether the wind was out of order, like you will see a light southwesterly wind. That would suggest a circulation. The next thing you look for from a ship is the period between the swells, because the longer the period would suggest the stronger the wind that is generating that period between the swells, as we call it the fetch. So those were things that we were using in those days without having the technology. Also, I could recall an experience opposite to what Dr. Garstang mentioned. I was the duty forecaster one night at CARICOM, and Mr. Nichols came to the office to pick up Mr. Grinstead. And he looked at the chart. This was about 8 o'clock at night, and he saw a ship with a light southwesterly wind. And he asked me if I had issued a warning to the island chain. And I said, no, Mr. Nichols, because that ship is in the Pacific. As meteorologists and observers who know, there is a code to tell you whether the ship is in the Atlantic or the Pacific. So we disregarded it. He said, oh no, you cannot do that. He said, this is too important. This ship is too near to the Eastern Caribbean. And he issued he gave me a warning to be issued, and I gave it to the observer. I said, go and put it on the teletype and send it up the island chain. And I looked at Mr. Nichols. Now, he is my boss.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mr. Nichols, I would suggest you contact Puerto Rico, because Dr. Colon was then in charge of the Eastern Caribbean warning system instead of Miami in Puerto Rico. I say, I suggest you contact Dr. Colon, which he did. And shortly after, the answer came back to say, ship not in Atlantic, ship in Pacific. So he gave me, he said, you need to send a recall. And I looked at him, I said, Mr. Nichols, you sent the warning out, you should send the recall, as you disregarded what I told you. Yes. Some years later, he came to Belize and told that story to my meteorological staff. So those are some of the lessons learned in the early days, how to use ship reports, pilot reports, and so on. And I would like to add one more in terms of what Dr. Garstang said about the pilot. We had a British Overseas Airways captain flying to the tropics for the first time. And he came down, and I gave him the briefing because he was going back up from Trinidad, Barbados to Bermuda, and then across to London. There was a hurricane just east of Antigua. And I told him he should fly further west over Puerto Rico instead of the normal. And he looked at the winds, which from the hurricane would give him a good tailwind if he flew further east. And I advised him against it. And in those days, after you gave a pilot a briefing, you get them to sign that they were briefed and who gave the briefing. Certainly he went up and he got tangled in that hurricane. Mm-hmm. And as a result, a passenger that was in the toilet was flown up into the ceiling. And it took a Pan American plane that was flying south to be able to give him information as to how to get out of that hurricane. To cut the story short, there was a commission of inquiry. And as usual, the first person they would blame is the forecaster for giving a bad forecast. But we had it on record, and he signed. And the next thing that happened to that captain, he was downgraded to fly cargo planes. So those are two experiences that I will never forget in terms of being a young forecaster in the Eastern Caribbean.
That's really good. You stood your ground and used the science and that bore out. And that's a great lesson for our folks to understand that you follow what the observations are saying and what you understand of the science. I have one final question for you. As the founding director of the National Meteorological Service of Belize, what do you consider to be the benefits of having an organization like the CMO, even though you still have your National Met Service?
Oh, two things. In the formative stage, the CMO was very helpful in the drafting of a plan because as usual, the Met Service in Belize was just an observation station under the Civil Aviation Department. And I put together a 20-year plan that included the training that we will need, the infrastructure, type of network, and what we wanted. I consulted with the CMO, and Mr. Nichols gave me some excellent suggestions as to how to improve my document. And that document was fully accepted by the Cabinet of Belize. So that was one of the very useful role that CMO played in the development of the National Meteorological Service of Belize. Secondly, another important role was the getting a network of radars. And I think Belize was the first to really benefited from having a radar at the station in our own building. And I will give an example of that. In 1974, we had 2 hurricanes back to back in September, 2 weeks apart. The first one was Hurricane Carmen. And with the radar, we were able to give accurate movements of the hurricane. And I could recall that Dr. John Lee, he was at CMI at the time, was so interested in some of the photographs that we had taken and wanted to publish a paper. But the important part about it is that we were able to guide the government as to what warnings were needed. And the hurricane passed over the northern district of Corozal. We had not even a single loss of life. Right across the border in Mexico, they had extreme damage to their infrastructure and loss of life. The difference was the warning that we were able to give with that radar. The second hurricane, Fifi, came to the southern part of Belize. And again, using that radar, we are able to provide timely warnings, as Dr. Garston said about the ship in Barbados. And even though we had storm surge in excess of 15 feet, there was not a single loss of life. We had damage, but not a loss of life. Just to the south of us, where they had no warnings in Honduras, they had 11,000 deaths. So I am one of the firm believers that the CMO plays a very critical role in getting instrumentation such as radars and other monitoring systems to the region. And I would endorse very strongly the role and services of the CMO.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dazi, for that ringing endorsement. We're very pleased to be able to continue to support our region, that foundation that you, Dr. Lee, Dr. Garstan laid as regional forecasters and as leaders of your national meteorological services and continuing research. And then you went on to much greater contributions in terms of climate change as the first director of the 5 Cs. I thank you so much for your time. At this point, I'm going to be opening up for questions from the audience. I'm sure that some of our folks who have joined us, we have the chief meteorologist of CIMH on with us. We have several other persons from all sorts of Met services. We have a couple of our retired directors from the Trinidad and Tobago Met Service, Mr. Mills with us and Mr. Mulchan and Mr. Noel I see in the list. We also have the current director of the Barbados Meteorological Department, Mr. Simmons, with us as well. So I'm opening up the floor now for any questions from the audience to all this great stuff that you've been hearing. Miss Kathy Ann Caesar, Chief Meteorologist of Trinidad of CIMH, you have the floor.
Okay, that wasn't a Freudian slip. I'm still somewhat affiliated with Trinidad and Tobago. And forgive me, I'm actually on two meetings at the same time. I just have a quick question for Dr. Gascan. Understanding that you were working, I believe, were you working at the Met Office Trinidad for Hurricane Flora? And what was that experience like? We currently hear stories about that particular event. Could you enlighten us a little bit about that?
No, I think that's John. Kathy Ann,
John
I think,
Lee?
yes, that
Okay.
would have been John Lee, because by then Dr. Garston would have left. But
okay, yeah, but it's John Lee. I hear a lot of stories about that particular event and how actions by the Met Office saved a lot of lives. And I really would like to know about that experience, especially for our budding forecasters. When you have so much data and you were able to do such a very good forecast on very little data.
So Dr. Lee?
Dr. Lee?
Yes. Well, I think Flora showed its ugly head late on a Sunday night, if I remember correctly. I had no knowledge of it. The staff didn't call me to inform me about it. I found out about it because I visited the ministry that Monday morning and I was asked a question about the storm and I had no clue. So I rushed back to the office very quickly. When I got there, I learned that the forecaster on duty, I can't remember who it was, had issued an advisory warning that Tobago would be hit at 11 o'clock the Monday night. When I looked at the data, which of course is very sparse, the Caribbean is a region of very sparse data. I mean, we are just a bunch of ships in the sea for practical purposes. When I looked at what we had, I realized that that was too late. I upped the advisory to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Flora hit at 2 o'clock. I was hauled over the coals by everybody for making that mistake. And that's one of the main things I remembered of Flora. Of course, she hit Tobago. I was not allowed to go to Tobago for almost 6 months after that. I was in the doghouse. In fact, I was subjected to an investigation by the ministry. As you well know, Flora went on to sit over Cuba for 5 days. Castro accused the Americans of succeeding it to make it stay there. But when I had a chance to get to Tobago, because a group of people from Jamaica and Barbados came to Trinidad the following February, I believe it was, to discuss what we call it, not just hurricane procedures, but the aftermath. And they went to Tobago, and I was allowed by the ministry to join them in Tobago. One of the first things I realized when I saw the damage was that there must have been a tornado in the eye of Flora. As a matter of fact, it was an interesting thing because when I got back to Trinidad in April of 63, Flora was a 63 storm. I had to deal with somebody in the Treasury Department, and I mentioned the problem of hurricanes and what I would need to do my job with hurricanes. And the guy said to me, those things don't come here. Turned out he was one of the top members of the Red Cross. And after Flora, he would go to the Bay every week and he would never watch me in the eye. He'd never face me in the eye.
Oh dear. Anyway, thank you, Dr. Lee. It's interesting to hear the story of Flora, and it was devastating so much for them. But as you indicated, the earlier forecast was was quite different, and you brought that forward.
Oh yes.
Are there any other questions for our distinguished panel? Kathy Ann, do you have another question, or is that an old hand?
A legacy hand, thank you.
Are there any other questions? We're now at 12:09. So I know there are a lot of forecasters here, and I see also we have Albert Jones representing the 5Cs with us. Oh, Miss Jody Ann Petrie from CIMH, you have the floor.
Dr. Leng, Mr. Mulchan also has his
Oh,
hand up.
Mr. Mulchan, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. You had your hand up earlier. So let's see to Mr. Mulchan first, Miss Petrie. Mr. Mulchan, go ahead, please.
First of all, I want to, it's an honor to be among such, honor and privilege to be among such esteemed meteorologists. But I would like to ask Dr. Gaston or Dr. Leslie, in the absence of ship reports, what other guidance they had in determining that there was some rotating system east of us in those days without satellite imagery? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Arlene, could you repeat that? It's not.
Okay. So Mr. Mulchan is asking, in addition to the ship reports and those aircraft observation, what were some of the other observations you had to rely on during that period?
Every island in the British Caribbean Met Service took meteorological measurements on the ground. That is, describing the atmosphere in its temperature, humidity, wind speeds, cloudiness, weather, and other details. Those reports were all sent into the main offices like Trinidad, plotted on the maps, and 4 synoptic maps, as they're called, which cover from the Central America right across to Africa, the total field of pressure, temperatures, rainfall distributions, cloudiness, and we use that in conjunction with reports from elsewhere, like the aircraft reports that I talked about, and the ships that occasionally would be in the network. The point being that there was little definitive information in terms of the depth of the atmosphere. Little was known. In talking about wave periods and other information, it was unusual, if not unheard of, for a ship to tell us what the wave periods were. Instrumentation like that we developed in the 1960s, and that has been put out, and a primary attempt at understanding the tropical atmosphere is to understand how energy is transferred from the sea surface to the atmosphere to drive the atmosphere. In the final analysis, the sole source of energy for all weather, a breeze, rain, anything, is the sun. That heat from the sun has to be absorbed at the Earth in various ways. The Earth has to distribute that heat in such a way that where there is excess heat, it is removed, whereas there is a limited amount of heat, it is supplemented so that there is a budget that equals 0. If it did not equal 0, the tropics would boil, the poles would freeze. These are major atmospheric processes that go on that are incorporated in the detail of a particular forecast. The forecast is, as your speakers have well indicated, depend upon detailed understanding, experience, knowledge of what to look for, particularly in a situation where there's a limited amount of information. Because there's so much ocean involved, that situation, despite satellites, has not been markedly improved.
Thank you, Dr. Garstang. Ms. Petrie, your turn.
I actually got my answer because I had a similar question and it was answered, but I guess I could just say a statement because as I was listening, first of all, I was quite excited when I saw this the post go out for this webinar. But I was listening and I was like, wow, this is where we're coming from. Like you have one ship that you got information from and that was able to like, save an entire island. And nowadays, like if you tell somebody that you're a meteorologist, the first thing like you get side-eyed, like they look at you like you never get it right. And I'm like, if persons only knew where we're coming from, I think would definitely start to have a greater appreciation for meteorologists and what we do, you know, to help build resilience and save lives in the region. So yeah, thank you for everything that you guys have done to contribute towards where we are today.
Thank you. I wanted to acknowledge Mr. Rodney Martinez, who is the WMO head of the regional office of North America, Central America, and the Caribbean. Welcome, Rodney. Do you have anything you might like to say?
Many thanks, Arlene. As always, it's a pleasure to share this space of celebration of 50 years of the CMO and listen from these experienced people, the people with all these histories about the development and important contribution of CMO through the years. So we are very pleased and happy to be part of this celebration and this space. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We are very pleased to have the WMO be leading activities that are really critical to us, such as the Hurricane Committee and the Severe Weather Forecast Committee and others. And now with the early warnings for all, that's a major activity in our region. So we really thank you. I'd like to ask everyone to turn on their cameras, please, so that we can have a group photo in honor of this great occasion. How
would I do that?
Yes, you're there already, John. You're fine. We can see you, and we can see Dr. Garston. We can see Dr. Leslie. We need to have some of the other folks. I see Mr. Simmons from the Bahamas is with us as well.
I can't get my camera on.
You can't get your camera on. Okay. Well, anyone who can, we can get them on here so that we can do a screenshot. All right. I've seen more people. John Peters, okay. Kimberly, okay. Jodianne, you're not going to show your face. You just gave the question and the statement. Okay. Mr. Mulchan, you're not visible. We need to see you again. You're, oh, there you are. Okay, great. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to ask you all to smile a while, and I will grab the screen. Smile. That's one. We have the group. I will do another one because we have some folks who are, yes, let's try Dr. Hamilton. You're not showing yourself.
The camera isn't working.
Oh, your camera isn't working. Okay. So I'll do another one. I can see Mr. Simmons now. Thank you. Everybody smile. That's great. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just wanted to acknowledge a few more persons. I'll share my screen once more so that they are properly acknowledged while as a part of our wrap up here. So I wanted to acknowledge persons who have contributed to this particular event. First, our speakers who have not only given us that broad history today, but laid that foundation that we're all standing on. We have also have assistance with gathering of information in our member states, such as videos and photos that we will be sharing as part of a commemorative video later. I'm showing here our anniversary committee members who have been assisting in that process, and I want to say thank you to them. And to those of you who have not yet made your reservations to come to Trinidad and Tobago, we are looking forward to welcoming you to the formal celebration, which will be on the 15th of November. This webinar is the first of a series. We will be having other ones of conversations like this with our retired folks from CIMH and from the Met Services over the next couple of weeks. So look out for the announcements. There'll be another one next week and another one the week after. These are all part of our celebration of our 50th anniversary. And we are very pleased to have so many of you join us today. And I don't want to take too much more of your time, but to say a big thank you. And we're very pleased that you're here celebrating with us. And we look forward to the CMO being available to support the region for another 50 years. So thank you, everyone.